By 1981, Buck Rogers had a bigger budget, darker lighting, fewer jokes, and the emotional warmth of an abandoned mall food court, which is impressive because it was also somehow less science fiction. This is the story of how a show that rode Star Wars afterburners straight into pop culture orbit managed to lose its identity and by season 2 its own pulse. This is the fall of Buck Rogers in the 25th century. When Buck Rogers in the 25th Century premiered in 1979, it knew exactly what it was doing. The theatrical plot released to cinemas first because coincidence was bright, goofy, sexy, and unapologetically disposable. It was disco sci-fi, space opera with feathered hair, a future where the apocalypse somehow led to spandex, synth, and Aaron Gray being the most charismatic person in any room. While Gil Gerard's Buck wasn't a hero from legend, he was a wisecracking astronaut waking up 500 years too late and flirting his way through dread, or rather existential dread. Wilma Deering wasn't a damsel, instead, she was a competent adult constantly babysitting Buck's ego. Dr. Hua was a walking PSA about technocratic overreach, and Tweaky was merchandising gold with anxiety issues. The tone was clear that this was fun. It's not profound, not mythic, but fun, and audiences showed up. Even at its peak, Buck Rogers was already straining against itself. Behind the glossy future and disco sheen was a show carrying a roughly 800,000 per episode budget, an enormous gamble for late 70s television science fiction. NBC wanted a hit big enough to justify the cost, while Universal wanted longevity, and the producers wanted to keep the tone light enough to attract broad audiences. What they got instead was a series constantly arguing with itself. Former actor Jock Gaynor took on production duties for much of the run, attempting to stabilize a production that was successful enough to survive, but not successful enough to be left alone. Ratings were solid, critical reception was lukewarm, and that combination is poison in television because it convinces executives that everything needs fixing all at once. And no one was more vocal about what needed fixing than the man at the center of the frame. And that's Gil Gerard, who didn't hate Buck Rogers, more like he hated what he thought it was setting for. From early on, Gerard clashed with the producers at NBC over tone, bristling at scripts he felt leaned too hard on jokes and winking self-awareness. In his view, Buck had become a perpetual smartass cracking quips instead of anchoring the series as a legitimate science fiction lead. But this wasn't quite dissatisfaction. Gerard frequently refused to perform lines he found too broad or too silly, rewrote dialogue on his own, and pushed for scripts that emphasized Buck as a dominant heroic force, often at the expense of the ensemble. In at least one case, he outright vetoed an ending where Wilma rescued Buck, insisting that moment be restructured. From Gerard's perspective, he was fighting for the show's future, but from the producer's perspective, he was undermining the very tone that made the series accessible, and from NBC's perspective, he was a liability attached to an expensive asset. This was more like creative attrition instead of creative tension. Production on season 2 didn't just stall, it hit the brakes, thanks to the 1980 actors' strike, and it shows. And when Buck Rogers finally limped back into production that fall, it returned fundamentally altered, like a show that had gone away for the summer and came back insisting it was finding itself. The first red flag, a brand new production team led by John Mantley, a man whose resume leaned heavily towards television westerns, which immediately explained why outer space was about to be treated less like a future battlefield and more like the Oregon Trail with laser pistols. Then came the format overhaul. Earth? Mostly irrelevant now. Defending the planet from existential threats? Gone. The Draconian Empire? The show's antagonistic force, its most coherent sense of conflict? Vanished without ceremony, as if the writers simply forgot they existed or decided villains were passe. Instead, Buck and Wilma were packed onto an Earth ship called the Searcher and sent drifting across space on a noble, slow moving quest to locate humanity's lost tribes scattered in the aftermath of Earth's nuclear war. It was a sweeping premise, it was somber, and it was completely the wrong show. This was more like a genre drift instead of evolution. It's a borrowed premise lifted straight from Glenn A. Larson's Wandering Humanity playbook, grafted onto a series that had previously thrived on immediacy, humor, and recognizable stakes. The Draconians gave the show tension, Earth gave it purpose. Season 2 removed both and replaced them with vague destiny and endless travel time. What had once been bright, punchy, and personality driven was now a dual space road trip searching for meaning it didn't need, while quietly abandoning everything that made it work. And audiences felt that disconnect instantly. Viewers didn't tune in to watch Buck Rogers wander the galaxy in search of abstract ideas. They tuned in for momentum, for conflict, for a future that actually felt connected to something. Season 2 offered none of that. With a draconian empire erased and Earth pushed to the margins, the show removed its villains, its stakes, and its sense of urgency in one sweep. What replaced them was drift. Worse, the tonal shift alienated everyone all at once. While older viewers weren't giving anything substantial enough to replace it, the show asked its audiences to take it more seriously without giving them a reason to, so they left. Ratings fell quickly. Enthusiasm evaporated, and the once bright future of Buck Rogers dimmed into quiet indifference. Season 2 wasn't rejected because it was different. More like it was rejected because it felt empty, like a show going through the motions after misplacing its own reason to exist. And once an audience stopped caring, no amount of course correction can bring them back. At that point, the future was already canceled. So here's the uncomfortable truth. Everyone involved had a point. Gerard wasn't wrong that the show lacked critical respect. NBC wasn't wrong to worry about budgets without prestige. The producers weren't wrong to fear losing the fun that made the show work. But instead of choosing a direction, Buck Rogers tried to satisfy them all at once and ended up satisfying no one, only to discover that respectability doesn't keep the lights on when no one's watching. Instead of evolving the show, season 2 embalmed it. What was once bright, ridiculous, and alive became quiet, self important, and terminally embarrassed by its own premise. A series about the future that couldn't imagine a world where escapism was enough. And that's the real lesson here. Genre television doesn't die because it's silly, it dies because it forgets why people showed up in the first place. Buck Rogers was canceled by insecurity, and in television, especially science fiction, there's no faster way to erase the future than apologizing for it. Now, there's a strange twist of irony in how it all played out. Buck Rogers came first, years before Flash Gordon ever hit the comic pages. And yet, it was the 1980 Flash Gordon film that became the cult classic, precisely because it knew what it was. It embraced the camp, leaned into the excess, and wore its charm proudly. Buck Rogers, meanwhile, spent its 1981 season doing the exact opposite, backing away from its own personality, apologizing for its tone, and sanding down everything that made it distinctive. And as we say, the rest is history. So was the show. This is Pulp Vision, because we remember the fun, so you don't have to watch it disappear again.